Good evening. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm grateful to share the stage with my friend of 36 years. I think I should point out that the first 3 years, from 1970 to about 1973, I didn't agree with her. We did argue because I had been told in my PhD program certain aspects of history. I knew my documents, I thought. And he would say, well, that's not how I see it. And I said, well, I've never seen that evidence. And so I spent those 3 years and changing my worldview and also going out into documents that hadn't been searched. And I came to the conclusion that what has happened is selective history on the part of the white males who dominate the writing of history. They don't study all the documents. They don't study the complete Constitutional Convention. They don't study all the papers that are available to them. For example, General Thomas Gage was the British general in charge of sending the troops to Lexington and Concord to start the revolution. He is the British general that sent the troops up Bunker Hill. Stationed in Boston during the American Revolution, since 1763, he had also been in charge of American Indian affairs, both in the southern colonies and the northern colonies. He had extensive correspondence with Superintendent Sir William Johnson in New York. And during the American Revolution, when they lost Boston, General Gage packed up his papers, tied them with red tape, which is the expression we get, cutting through the red tape, tied them up with red tape, and shipped them back to England. Scholars read those papers as they related to the political factions of patriots and loyalists and neutrals of the white persuasion. I was the first scholar to look at the papers that he wrote on American Indians. And we would unwrap now faded packs of documents, the curators and I, these faded ribbons, these faded red tapes. We'd open them up, and we'd open up the documents. Now, in the 18th century, one of the ways you blotted your letter was you sprinkled sand on it, and then you knocked the sand off, and the sand fell off the page, and that blotted the ink. But after more than 2 centuries, tiny grains of sand had still stuck to the ink back in the 1760s and 1770s. But now, when I was reading them in the 20th century, this sand was no longer adhering to the ink. And at the end of every day of going through these documents, I had a little pile of 18th century sand at the end of my desk. And the curator knew I was interested in the red tape. He says, "You want one of those red tapes?" I said, "Oh, yeah." So I have that red tape. All right, now look, if this guy is in charge of Indian affairs in the 1760s and the 1770s, he's the British official reporting to the Crown. If we haven't read his papers, what haven't we read? And every time Irv would say something, I would say, well, I don't understand that, but I will keep looking. And I remember one time in the early 70s, he told me something. He said, "This is what we think." I said, "Irv, I couldn't testify to that in court." But in 1977, I found what he was looking for. And I was really excited because I believed him that his viewpoint was valid. I just needed to see it for myself, because in the white court system, as you probably already know, oral testimony of oral tradition doesn't count unless you can back it up with documentary evidence, P.S., written by white people. So everything that Irv has taught me in terms of Haudenosaunee worldview, Onondaga worldview, I am confident in looking at even the most skeptical of you and saying, I can prove from a white point of view that what he is saying is right. Because in every generation, there have always been, unfortunately, a minority, but there has always been a minority of white people who understand what is right versus what is expedient. And they have interviewed people and they have written letters. For example, in 1815, at the end of the War of 1812, the United States Senate was debating the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent is a major keystone of American Indian law and Haudenosaunee law in the sense that it says that every right that an American Indian had prior to the start of the War of 1812, they have after the War of 1812, whether they were neutral, pro-British, or pro-United States. Every right is intact. The United States demolishes this for many people during removal. But during the debates over the Treaty of Ghent in the United States Senate, the United States Senator from New York, Rufus King, who was one of the 55 white men who wrote the Constitution, whose notes are regarded as the most accurate reflections of what the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was all about. Why isn't James Madison's notes regarded as the most extensive? Because in 1987, James Hudson, a historian, proved without a doubt that towards the end of his life, James Madison altered his notes to fit the crime, to fit what he wanted people to think went on in the Constitutional Convention. That meant Rufus King is the valid observer of the Constitutional Convention. He stands up in the United States Senate and he reviews Indian rights. Now, he's a senator from New York. He's a Federalist. He's a conservative. He's not a liberal. He stands up at the United States Senate and he gives this long speech, the last phrase of which is, with regard to American Indians, quote, "The sovereignty of the United States is not absolute." Now, Governor Pataki isn't referring to Rufus King. President Bush, assuming he could even find a reference to Rufus King, isn't talking about Rufus King. And I don't mean to just pick on the Republicans because Clinton is no better. Every Democrat, every Republican who's been president has nailed American Indians to the wall. And it really doesn't matter who it was. Because we're a democracy and it's majority rule. And the presidents realize that, hey, we're not going to get anywhere if we support this tiny minority of less than 2% of the population. Okay, so my premise is that everything I'm saying that you might think is pro-Irv Palace version is actually based on my own research and in documents that I can support whatever it is that Irv has taught me these 36 years, because that's what the white court system insists on. The white court system insists that it have the testimony has substance, not just from oral tradition, but also from the white documents. For those of you who are young and are studying in graduate school or undergraduate school, I think one of the things that you should be encouraged about is that people who live in an oral tradition can be depended on to direct you toward the right ideas. And don't think that just because it's an oral tradition, it's might be a little loose on the facts. Also, you should use James Madison, who later becomes president, you should use James Madison as an evidence that the documents aren't always telling the truth either. That you can alter the documents, or you can release them and pretend that it's a breach of national security. See, it depends on who's sitting in the chair. Well, okay, here we go. This is the dates. These are the dates that you've got to remember. Are you ready? Here we go. 1142, 1492, 1524, 1613, 1677, 1744, 1768, 1784, 1794. Thank you very much. That's all you need to know. If you know those dates, you've got it nailed. Let's go back. 1142 is, of course, pre-European contact, but it is the founding of the Confederacy and the establishment of the Confederacy based on new spiritual messages, but also based on the traditions that had existed before, the spiritual messages that had existed before. So the Confederacy reaches back in terms of time well beyond 1142 in the sense of its culture, in the sense of its spirituality. 1142. 1492, quoted by that supposed liberal, that Democrat in the Supreme Court. What's her name? Nice person. She wrote the Sherrill decision. Ginsburg. She justified the occupation of the United States on Indian land by the right of discovery. That has got to be the most obscene idea. But think of that. The right of discovery. Okay, that's 1492. You think about how obscene that is. And we'll move right along. We'll go to 1524. 1524. A smallpox or perhaps other epidemic had broken out in 1520 in Florida because Spanish conquistadors were raiding the coast of Florida for slaves to take it back to the Caribbean. They inadvertently introduced smallpox and other epidemic diseases in 1520. By 1524, those epidemic diseases are in western New York in Seneca country because of the Indian trade routes. Indians are dying in western New York of white diseases introduced accidentally from the Caribbean because Indian trade routes are so efficient they're bringing stuff up from Florida to western New York. So by the time Cartier arrives in 1534 up in the St. Lawrence, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, and other Indian people are already under the attack of horrible diseases. 1613 is the date of the two-row wampum. 1613 is the date when there is an agreement between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee to take separate paths but share the same physical space, a philosophical concept which is certainly useful throughout history. In 1677, there's the Silver Covenant chain belt, the first agreement that we know of with the state of New York. The Silver Covenant chain establishes an economic and spiritual and political link, the Silver Covenant chain of 1677. 1744, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Canandaigua stands up and suggests to Ben Franklin and others at the Treaty of Lancaster that the colonies should unite as the Haudenosaunee do. 1768, are you listening, conservatives? Are you listening, Governor Pataki? I know you're not listening, George, but maybe Gonzales is listening. In 1768, the colonial government of the British under Sir William Johnson, that was responsible for Indian affairs, reported to Gage, who's coordinating all of this, and he's going to report back to the Crown in London, that they're going to establish a treaty called the First Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768, with the specific goal of separating the Haudenosaunee from the state of New York and establishing the western boundary. Are you listening, Governor Pataki? The western boundary of the colony of New York. And the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is put through. And the Treaty of Fort Stanwix ends the colony of New York at Rome, New York. That's how it stands at the time of the American Revolution. That's how it stands when the American Revolution breaks out. You can find this in Gage's papers. You can find this in the Sir William Johnson papers. There is no doubt about it. The British government stops the expansion of the colony of New York to preserve peace with native people and establishes that boundary. Now we jump to 1779. The Sullivan Campaign, which devastates over 40 towns in Cayuga and Seneca country, starts in August of 1779, but it's preceded by an event which the Onondagas know all too well, and about which I wish more was known among the non-Indian public of Syracuse and New York State. On April 21st, Colonel Goose Van Schack led an army of patriots, including the 3rd New York, and attacked and destroyed Onondaga towns. During that attack, his orders had been from James Clinton to avoid rape. Clinton said, "Bad as the savages are," that's a quote, "bad as the savages are," unquote, "they do not rape," which is true. So Van Schack went in to Onondaga, and they slaughtered civilians. And then the soldiers gang raped young Onondaga women, gang raped them, and then butchered them. And at the close of the American Revolution, one of the Onondaga leaders was talking to the British officer at Fort Niagara. And this Onondaga leader said that his people would never forget this. And this event was carried out by what he called, quote, Christians. Militant Christianity has a cruel, cruel history, and you do not have to go to the Middle East and study the Crusades to find out how militant Christianity can be brutally cruel, because the Van Schack campaign demonstrates that. The Sullivan campaign demonstrates that. 1784, Treaty of Fort Stanwix ends the war between the Haudenosaunee and the United States because the United States can't afford to continue the war. The revolution is over, but the revolution treaty, the Treaty of Paris, is made only between the subjects of the crown, George III, and the citizens of the United States. And in 1784, Native people are not citizens of the United States. They're not in the treaty at all. 1794, after a whole series of interesting legislation and negotiations, not the least of which are illegal negotiations carried out by, hello, Governor Pataki, the state of New York, the Treaty of Canandaigua is passed. In negotiations with the Haudenosaunee, the George Washington government makes a treaty in which the obligations of both sides are mutual, and the resolution of conflict will be